Hello, everyone. Welcome, one and all. This is the Do Dissidents podcast. My name is Keaton Weiss, reunited over a Zoom screen with my long lost co host, Richie Rosencrans. What's up, Richie?
What's up, everybody? Welcome
not-
back to the Richie Show.
Right, exactly. Richie's back from the south of France, took a year off. And so thanks for coming back. And not only do we have Richie back, but we have back for a second time the first guest we ever had on this show, Mr. Peter Frase. Peter is on the editorial board at the great Jacobin Magazine, is also the author of the book Four Futures, Life After Capitalism. Thank you, Peter, for coming back.
Yeah, nice to be back with you.
Absolutely, yeah. So this will be fun. These are not really fun times, but one of the reasons Peter, why I wanted to have you back, why I thought of you, is because, like I just said, you were the first guest we ever had on this show, and you came on to promote the brake light workshops that the Mid-Hudson Valley DSA was putting on. And I should have mentioned when I introed you that you were an active member of that group. And the point of the brake light workshops was obviously that people who had a brake light out could come and DSA would fix people's brake lights for free. And the idea of doing that in neighborhoods like Newburgh and neighborhoods throughout the Hudson Valley is to prevent mostly black and brown people from getting pulled over by the cops because a brake light is out, and then having that situation get worse. Either violent or, there are other ways it can get worse. Obviously, if you have a joint in the car, whatever, your license is expired. So you guys at DSA were on this issue, I feel like, before most of the rest of the left was. And it's really interesting because we've been talking about trying to spark this, quote unquote, political revolution for 5 years now. And it seems pretty obvious that this was the issue upon which that revolution could be launched all along. So what did DSA see that most of the left missed, and why do you think they missed it, and why do you think you guys didn't?
Well, I mean, I would start by saying that it's not so much I think that most of the left missed it, it's that most of the white left missed it. The reality is that, the left, like everything else in this country, is fairly segregated. And DSA is no exception to that. It's by no means an all-white organization, but it's a disproportionately white organization. And I think a lot of kind of white leftists were not quite attuned to the reality of people's daily interactions with the police. In the case of DSA, the brake light clinics were something that kind of bubbled up from our New Orleans chapter originally, where there were just some activists there who were kind of tuned in to struggles around police and prisons, and also had an interest in mutual aid, which is another thing that since the pandemic people have taken more interest in. That they were the ones who kind of initiated this, and other chapters just looked at it and said, "Hey, this is a great thing to do." It was, however, at the time, somewhat controversial within DSA whether this was even a good idea for us to be working on. There were people who basically said, this mutual aid stuff like brake lights is, too much like charity work, and it distracts us from, working on electoral campaigns or pushing for Medicare for all or what have you. So there was, even from the very beginning, there was some tension over whether it was a good idea. But we here in the Mid-Hudson Valley, looked at the fact that we're organizing in places like Newburgh and Poughkeepsie and Kingston, where this is definitely an issue for people, especially up, here in an area where there are plenty of poor working class people and black and brown people, but not the kind of public transportation that you have down in New York City. And so people gotta drive, and not necessarily in a position always to get their brake lights fixed. So it just seemed like a natural thing for us to do. And yeah, now of course the larger issue of policing has been kind of put to the forefront. And I think a lot of people had been working on it for years, but a lot of other people are catching up to it now.
Richie, do you have anything to add or ask on that?
Well, I was recently looking at cartoons, I think late 60s and early 70s, where they showed, poor Black Americans in the ghetto, and the police were often drawn as, caricatures of swine, of pigs, because that's, I guess, when that term started to come around. And it's interesting that the thought has been there that the idea of, I'm not condoning calling people names. I like pigs. the whole like issue of policing poor black communities, that's not new. So it's sort of baffling why it took America to watch a white cop kneel on a black man's neck, killing him, to do something about this. So what white America is prepared to do is a really interesting topic. But when you look at like now how the laws are being changed to unprotect police and to to go to a certain length, it feels like it's the institution in the institution of government, which is very heavily financially bogged down in the police poverty prison pipeline industry thing, that they're deciding how far we should go in terms of what we should do with our police. And that's a debate between giving them more money on one end of it to abolishing them on the other end of it. Is it safe to ask where DSA fits in that spectrum?
I mean,
And
yeah. I mean, so I'm not gonna speak for like the national organization. I'm not sort of where we are on a like policy level. Practically, I think a lot of people, including our chapter, are very active on defund the police campaigns, which are uh, very much inspired by the perspective of police and prison abolitionism, although they're not the same thing, and not everyone who works on that is necessarily an abolitionist. But that's certainly where a lot of the energy in both Mid-Hudson Valley DSA and other DSA chapters is going right now. I mean, and to just sort of speak to the question, again, to this question, why it comes up now, and why we are where we are this time, when this, police killings of, black people have been going on forever. I think you think back to kind of the last big upsurge of protests that we had around, Ferguson, and the uprising that happened in Ferguson, Missouri, with Mike Brown, and the difference between then and now, and how that sort of set the stage for what's happening now. Because back then, of course, you had Obama as president, who was at least, you had a black president who was at least willing to make some show of actually caring about this issue, as opposed to a president who just is forthrightly, a white supremacist and pro-cop. But also what Obama and what a lot of kind of liberals did at that time was push for these kind of procedural reforms. Rather than saying we need to radically scale back policing, it was like, oh, we need body cameras, we need de-escalation training, we need implicit bias and racial sensitivity training, all of which, of course, mean more resources are going to the police rather than less. And now I think with the killing of George Floyd, you look at that department in Minneapolis, they did all that stuff. They had the body cameras, they had the bias training, all that stuff, and it didn't matter. The same thing still happened. And so I think people are willing to step it up a notch now and say, look, that's not going to do it. We need some more radical solution.
Well, it's so interesting that you mentioned that the defund movement is really inspired by the abolitionist movement. Okay. And I just wrote a piece on this. People who think that defund is too radical, they don't understand that defund came from a more radical side.
right.
And so from that more radical side is inspired a slightly less radical side. And now the New York City Nurses Union is now out saying we want increased taxes on the rich and we want billions of dollars slashed from the NYPD to go to public hospitals. Now, they are not using the phrase defund. So, in other words, they're now taking it down another notch. But none of that happens without people making the quote unquote extreme statement at the onset, right? So, in other words, all of this sprung from abolish. And then from abolish went to defund. So all the people who are sort of pro-clutching and worried about, oh, this is too radical, we can't say that. That's how this kind of change works, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. Certainly, the people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore or Angela Davis, who have been sort of pushing abolitionism as a framework for thinking about this, really did lay the groundwork here. And I mean, I think it's also important to have that kind of abolitionist background when we're having these conversations, because when we say defund the police, that's not just, we don't just mean let's just cut the budgets and leave it at that, right? We do want to cut police budgets. I want to cut them to zero, but we want to put things in place to address the social needs and the harms that currently we address with policing. because we're not dealing with addiction, we're not dealing with homelessness, we're not dealing with mental illness, except by throwing cops at it. Is that's how we've gotten ourselves into this position. And so the nurses is a good example of that, talking about what should we be spending this money on. And that also speaks to the particular moment that this is arising and why it's taking the shape that it has, because we're in this economic crisis that was kind of initiated by the pandemic and the totally botched response to the pandemic. And in that environment, states, cities, counties are in horrendous budget crunches. Like, everybody knows that there's big budget fights happening or on the horizon. And so, we look at that now after years and years of sort of endlessly escalating resources going to cops. You look around here, Beacon, Newburgh, Poughkeepsie, cities like this, upwards of 20, 30% or more of the entire city budget is going to the police department. And so when it comes time to say, okay, we got to make somebody's going to get cut here. I think that's where we can say, okay, our priority is not keeping funding in the police. Our priority is to put it into these other areas.
That's interesting, Peter. That's a rational, financial bottom line. Like, an accountant can even make the case for defunding the police. And what else is interesting about it is when you talk to policemen and even pro-police, people who are not necessarily yet on board with the defund police fund community bus, they already admit, even though they're not on that bus yet, they admit that we're misusing the police, that we're overusing the police, that we're asking them to do too much, and we're asking them to do things that they should not be doing, like handling all the things you mentioned, mental health, homelessness, etc. And it's like, well, then how do you stop that when they're the ones getting huge amounts, huge percentages of our budgeting? You defund them and you move that money back to the other thing. And it goes back to the institutionalized white supremacy thing, where, like, if we start to actually fix poverty and fix the stuff that causes poor people, many of whom are people of color in this country, they're not going to have anybody to blame for it anymore, right? White people, like, I hear it all the time. I've been hearing it my whole life. I've been in and around the city of Newark my whole life. The blacks ruined Newburgh, quote unquote, or some version of that. And if we actually help remove the things that are forcing Black people into what I call generational poverty-induced traumatic response, right? Some people call that crime. When you push people to the point that we've pushed the Black community and the Latino community, and they do things like, creating systems in order to take care of themselves because the system has failed them, like, what do you expect to happen, right? So if we start to actually fix that, what are white people going to blame? They're only going to have one thing left to blame, and that's ourselves and the system that we created that did that. And I think people are freaked out about having to actually really go that far.
Sure, because to bring it back also to where, like, DSA as socialist comes down on this question. We look at this and recognize that the police serve a function in protecting private property. Like, that's, and it's done in a racist way because it's a racialized capitalist system, but fundamentally protecting power and wealth and sort of maintaining the great inequalities in this country is what the police are really for, right? Like, the reason that fundamentally, if you look at, for example, New York City, why is, Bill de Blasio so, afraid of the police? And one of the reasons is that the police serve the interests of the real estate lobby, which is one of the biggest and most powerful lobbies in New York and most big cities, which wants the police out there making the streets safe for gentrification and development, right? And so, when we're talking about abolish the police, abolish prisons, defund, ultimately, we don't get all the way there without getting out of capitalism. We know that. That's part of why we do this as socialists.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And Richie, I think you made a great point also. I just want to add an interesting note about Newburgh and the claim that, blacks ruined Newburgh. Um, Black people who came to Newburgh basically came as refugees. I mean, they really were from the Jim Crow South. There were billboards throughout southern states advertising that people could come to Newburgh, and we had a social welfare program in Newburgh. And so a lot of those people came up here literally escaping terror. And so that's just I just wanted to add that in because I know most of our listeners are not from this area, but this is where we all live. Richie, you and I grew up here. Peter, you've lived here for quite some time now, and you're very active here. And I think the connection that you made between the police state and the capitalist state is that missing link, and that's why I think that the left, uh, more broadly, I think wasn't quite ready to do with this issue what should have been done a long time ago. And I do think the fact that Barack Obama was president when Black Lives Matter was founded is a big part of that.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
I mean, no, go ahead,
sorry,
Richard.
because Peter brought up a great point about the real estate lobby in New York City and why it has De Blasio pinned up against the wall. It's the same thing in the city of Newburgh, and it's the same thing in 1,000 other places. Because the people that are the most vocal about pro-police here, eh, their interests are either almost completely in or directly tied to the real estate industry here. They're the same people, literally. And so we have to really start to unpack that because it's not a socialist. I mean, it is a socialist idea that the police are exist to protect property, but that's what the Supreme Court of the United States said. And they're not socialists. I forget what year it was or whatever, but they basically said,
Well, I mean, I think the socialists have a problem with that, whereas I think the people at the top don't. Right? I think
Right.
that's
And
the
the
issue.
difference between the liberal and conservative views of this is basically how honest they're willing to be about that. Which is like sort of like you were saying, that like, and we were talking about before, this distinction between this happening under Obama and happening under Trump is that, Obama would act like he wanted to do something about it and Trump doesn't. I think also what you're seeing now, even more so than during the initial uprising of Black Lives Matter, is this kind of people who are fed up with a sort of older model of urban Black politics, and like looking for something else. Like Keeanga Yamada Taylor, the socialist professor at Princeton, I had a article about this in the New York Times recently.
Outstanding article.
Yeah,
Outstanding
which
article
making the
that
point that
got
it was
yeah.
in the civil rights movement era, you still had a lot of these kind of like white political machines running cities that were predominantly non-white, and people were calling for we need Black leadership, we need Black mayors, and that's what we have now in a lot of places. You have places like Atlanta that has a Black mayor who is basically on the side in the position of having to defending the police and of sort of condemning protesters, and people are looking at this and saying, okay, like this this didn't do it. This didn't change things fundamentally. Just getting Black faces in high places. We need a new, more radical mode of urban politics.
James Clyburn and Hakeem Jeffries of the Congressional Black Caucus endorsed Elliot Engel over Jamal Bowman, who's running in New York. We're gonna probably put this episode out either Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. So by the time people are hearing this, Jamal Bowman better have won that fucking seat. He better have won that fucking seat by the time you guys are hearing this. But it's insane. It's absolutely insane. And that piece that you mentioned was so good. And notice it didn't really get anywhere, right? You didn't see that shared around because it's still an uncomfortable topic for much of the left, right? People don't want to criticize James Clyburn. They don't want to go there. Even Black people are nervous to go there, and here we are, three white guys going there.
Right.
So
And I
come
think
on.
part of that is the segregation and the kind of racism on the left, where people don't understand, or don't make the effort to understand Black politics enough to like understand the political divisions. That Black people are not a monolith politically, and that there are these divisions, and that they're based in class, and that they're based in power dynamics. And that if you look at that and understand that, then you can realize why you would have James Clyburn on one side of this fight, siding with Elliot Engel, and Jamal Bowman on another side of it. That reflects real political divisions that can't just be predicted from skin color.
well, that's the whole thing, right? Black people are not monolithic, and if we don't start carving room for them to not be seen as monolithic in all the ways, right? Even the ways that sort of give us white privilege in the progressive arm of politics, then what the hell are we doing?
Yeah, let me ask you. There was one other thing. No, I think we pretty much touched on those things. I do want to ask you guys though about some of the stuff that's been going on right around here. And when I say right around here, I'm talking about obviously in the Mid Hudson Valley, but this obviously applies everywhere because these kinds of protests are happening all over the country now in cities large and small. I've been cowering in my house for the last, 3 months. I mean, I had kids 15 months ago, so I've basically been locked in my house for the last year. So this hasn't been much of a thing for me. But I don't really go outside much. My wife has asthma, so I have to be like extra careful about this. But you guys have been out there, and so talk about that. I mean, you guys have been to these rallies, these protests. Just what's it like out there? You guys have been out doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to a lot of these things in Newburgh where I live and elsewhere. I was a couple weeks ago. I was at one in Poughkeepsie where there were thousands of people. It was maybe the biggest thing. I've lived up here for about 5 years or more, and it's probably the biggest thing like that I've ever seen here. It was just mostly very young people too, with a lot of kind of radical messages, including defund the police. And yeah, Richie and I were both in Newburgh when we had 1,000 or 2 people marching through the streets of Newburgh, and every city has been doing it. And it's very kind of like, it is very sort of, I don't want to say spontaneous, it is organized, but yet you do have these people, especially very young people, who are just coming out and showing up. I remember there was one, some organizers called a rally in Middletown, which is this, another small city, near here, where like they canceled the rally at the last minute and like 400 people showed up anyway.
Wow.
It's just like the energy there is tremendous. And, we've had some of our activists, DSA activists, have, been really building a defund the police campaign in the city of Beacon, which has been, we've had lots of people showing up to rallies. We've had people packing, the Zoom city council hearings to bring this message. So there's a lot of energy right now, I think, to try to, and it's a lot of things, right? I think part of it is also people are feeling the economic crunch from the crisis, and they have been kind of pinned up inside for a long time. So there's frustration, there's anger, and there's just a readiness to do something.
Peter brought up an interesting point that got me thinking, because I was talking about this with somebody else earlier. A lot of the currently elected officials, a lot of the people that are sitting in those seats now as elected officials, they got elected before all this exploded, and they were not prepared they didn't run on any of this stuff. On this topic, they were not prepared to get slammed with thousands of people screaming at them, cut police budgets this year, defund the police right now. And so I have respect for them being like, whoa, I got to learn about this, right? Because it's a big, big topic. It goes very deep, it cuts very deep. And I think as non-elected people who are very active in how much we read and in how much we talk and in how much we protest and whatever we do, it's our obligation as community members, and I'm saying this to everybody who's listening, help your electeds understand what this all means and what we can do, because they're going to be facing resistance, right? They passed a bunch of laws recently in Albany that don't go as far as a lot of us want to go. They're good measures. They move the ball forward, right? They do help. It isn't like they're not going to do anything and they're going to be useless. They're going to help to some degree. That degree might be very small compared to where we need to go, right? But they got pushback, right? They got blowback from police unions. And so if we go even further and I don't want to put our electeds out there to be resisted or intimidated by the police union. What we have to do is, protect, support, and make sure that our elected officials know they have thousands and thousands and thousands of people ready to show up at a moment's notice when they go to cut the police budget and tell the police unions, sorry.
Yeah, well, one other way of looking at that is that we have to intimidate them more than the police unions do. They have to fear us more than they fear the cops.
I'll give you Richie, you're right about the way that this has like caught a lot of these elected officials by surprise. I'll give you a concrete little example of that's played out, that you're aware of, that's played out in the city of Newburgh, where a few weeks ago we became aware, activists became aware that the city was redirecting $80,000 out of their community development block grant money that was supposed to go for park improvements. Now, the pandemic, for whatever reason, meant they couldn't spend the money on whatever they were originally going to spend it on. And the proposal was they were going to take this $80,000 and give it to the police department for something they were calling a new community policing initiative. Now, this is exactly the sort of thing that would have happened, in the past to make it look like you're doing something. We're going to give more money to the cops, but we're going to call it community policing without really specifying what that's going to be. And that's supposed to sound good and make it seem like we're addressing the problem. And I think what they were not expecting when they held a hearing on this proposal to move this $80,000, that me and 15 other people got on the speakers list and got on that call, all of us telling that this is the city council, this is absolutely unacceptable. That at a time like this, you would be talking about giving more money to the police and taking it away from parks. And so, they're used to hearing from the pro-cop faction, which is tied closely to the real estate development faction, and they're not used to hearing from us. We have to change that calculation.
Yeah. Just really quickly, I remember in that the mayor asked the city manager how many more people were lined up to say, "Don't you dare do that." And the city manager, this was after a bunch of us spoke, the city manager said, "We have 40 more people left." And the mayor grunted. He basically said, "Ugh." Because they had to sit there and go through 40 more people telling them the same thing. Now, here's what's interesting. The day before that, or the weekend before that, or whatever, they're like, "We want to hear from the public. We want to hear from the public. We want to hear from the public." So then the public shows up to tell them, and they now they don't want to hear it. I was a little taken aback by the mayor, and he should have been overjoyed to have that many people come there and tell our city council and exercise our democratic right to speak to our elected officials. So I'm not going to hold it against him. I'm just going to say that, we've been caught off guard. We've been, smacked in the face with this thing, and it's going to really show who we should reelect and who we should look to replace.
Well, yeah, absolutely, man. Because look, a lot of them do know better. James Clyburn knows better than to endorse Elliot Engel after saying into a hot mic that he only cares to speak about racial injustice because he's being primaried. James Clyburn met his wife in jail in 1960 after being arrested at a civil rights march. This guy knows better. This guy has been absorbed by the machine, right? To put it in very high school terms here. But that's what's happened. And they need to understand that this is not going to fly anymore. It's just not. We can't afford to have this shit fly anymore. And the other thing I'm worried about here, too, you know what? I shouldn't say I'm worried about it. I'm actually very hopeful because, as you said, Peter, excuse me, lots of these people in the streets are radicals. These are not people who are going to be happy and say, okay, we won because Aunt Jemima got taken off the shelf or Lady Antebellum changed their name or some monuments came down, right?
Right.
Not that that's insignificant, right? You do want to change the culture in a more forward-thinking way. I think it's weird that we have monuments up of, Southern generals and stuff like that, but it can't stop there. And I think people understand that. I don't see this going in a sort of hashtag Mick resistance kind of place.
No, it doesn't. And you're right. We actually need to see. I'm pretty radical. When we had one of the rallies that was organized by a wonderful gal named Nietzsche, who wants to do more. She wants to start doing pragmatic things in our city. And when she had that rally, a lot of people showed up, and it was the silent one. We all lined up on the sidewalk, and then at the end, it was wonderful. We created a circle out. Well, I didn't, but I helped. We created a circle out in the road, and people went into the middle of the circle to testify to the crowd. And the police were there. They were on the sideline. They were asked to come in. Our community doesn't want violence. Our community doesn't want to create an us and them issue right now because our community is vulnerable. They feel vulnerable. If stuff starts to go south, it's going to be bad for them. So they want to maintain the peace and they want to, work on this stuff, which I get. The police were asked to kneel. They didn't want to kneel. the crowd basically said, you're going to get down on your knees. Then at the end, they didn't want to kneel again. And a black woman who I don't know who she is, she basically said, is something the matter with your legs, boys? And so it's like they'll kneel for a photo op, and then but then they won't kneel when there's a bunch of people there in another way, or they'll say things like all lives matter, not antagonistically, but and it's like because they I don't want to demonize or vilify police people either. When they take the uniform off, they're a human being, and if we can get to that human being underneath that uniform and help to educate and enlighten them, maybe they'll quit.
But it does go to how, I think, again, the point of, the reason people are coming to the defund strategy now is how unreformable this institution is, right? It's not about these individual people.
Right.
It's about the institution, which is why, the studies show that you can have more black cops, they still kill the same number of people. It doesn't change anything. I think you probably saw there was a story that came out about one of the cops who knelt at one of the protests in New York, I think it was, and then said, apologized later to his fellow cops for kneeling. And said something like, the cop in me wanted to beat my own ass for doing that. That's the culture we're talking about. It's very, and the Punisher logos and the military style training and all of that stuff. Speaking specifically to what goes around in the Newburgh Police Department, it was only a few years ago, if you remember, that there was a scandal because the head of the police union here posted up a meme, the message of which was basically that he was not offended by the Confederate flag. He was more offended by black kids sagging their pants, so it's like, there's just some very deep-seated stuff going on here, and that's why we say this is not about changing individual hearts and minds of police officers, and it's not about reforming this fundamentally racist institution. It's got to go.
Well, they wear that on their sleeve. That's what the thin blue line is. I was talking to a friend on the phone, and he said, how could those three other cops just stand there while he's choking this guy under his knee? I said, well, that's the thin blue line. I said, they will not side with a civilian over another cop. If they're standing there and one cop's got his knee on a guy's neck and there are civilians saying, hey, you're hurting him, they're not going to say, hey, you know what? Yeah, they're right. You are leaning on him a little hard there. Why don't you let him up? He can't breathe. They're not going to do that. That's in the culture. That's codified, basically, in their culture.
Right. And so that's one of the things that I actually like about what the quote unquote reforms that are going on. It's the one part of it I really do actually appreciate and support is tearing down their immunity. But there's even arguments of how that isn't going to work. And I understand what they are too, because if there's nobody filming them, they're going to get away with the chokehold. They're going to do it anyway. And no one's going to be able to say that they did in order to prosecute them. And even if their immunity is taken away, I forget where I saw this report. It's not guaranteed that they're going to be prosecuted and found guilty, that they could be prosecuted but let off. So it's still there's still space there for them to not be held accountable. But if you take away their money, then the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, you make them smaller. That is what Peter said earlier. You can do body cams, right? You can do, qualified immunity, all this shit. But, one of the things that I like about a sort of socialist model for this is like, look, we asked a very, very simple question. Should this organization or should this institution be the same size? Should it be bigger or should it be smaller? And the very simple, clearest, perfectly rational stance on this is they should be smaller, right? I mean, that's obvious. It's staring you right in the face.
And it brings, and it's significant that this comes at the end of a neoliberal period when, it's in fact the case that the reaction, the post-Reagan reaction, it's not about small government, and it never was about small government.
Exactly.
It's about changing government from doing things that help people to the repressive functions of the government. And so I think for one of the things that's valuable in this moment for a lot of people, particularly white people, particularly people who don't have necessarily as many encounters with the police, don't realize, most of us don't sit around reading our municipal budgets very carefully and don't realize that police are taking up this huge amount of the budget and that share has been going up quite dramatically even over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And so then once you show that to people and they've realized just how out of control just on a quantitative level, how out of control the police have gotten, I think it makes it much easier to sell these arguments.
Yeah. NYPD's budget, $6 billion. That's an insane. I had to read that twice when I read it. I'm like, it's $6 billion.
Yeah, and they have like their own. They have like basically their own CIA that like posts officers in foreign countries. Like and has like a black budget that like nobody really knows how big it is. It's craziness.
Yeah. I mean, we had nurses tying garbage bags to themselves because they couldn't get PPE. And at the first sign of trouble, every cop in America looks like he was sent from 200 years in the future to come deal with this head to toe, state of the art, gear. It's the most obvious thing in the world, and it's perfectly rational. One of the other arguments against the defund, right? So many of these, white liberals were, oh, well, it's unclear what that means, right? The right is going to use it again. It's not unclear what it means at all. It doesn't mean abolish. It means cut funding. And that message is getting across. We're seeing this is being proven right as we speak right now. Like I said, I just wrote a blog where I rattled off all the major cities who are cutting police budgets, or at least have, people on the council saying we have to. It's huge. People are actually defunding the police because the demand was simple, clear, and rational. Defund the police.
Right. Right.
I mean, it is absurd to me that people can try to make the argument that there's something unclear about defund police as a demand. I mean, clearly what actually liberals who don't want to address this problem want is to use slogans like reform the police, which are in fact vague and meaningless, and you can basically attach them to anything and say you've done something.
Yeah, I made that exact same point. What is more unclear? Reform, reimagine, transform. Some guy in the Atlantic had a column say unbundle the police, as if that's clear. What the fuck does that mean? I mean, it's absolute garbage. Defund is obviously the best. And that's why it organically arose out of this groundswell of grassroots activism, because it's the simplest, it's the most logical, and it's the best.
Yeah, and some abolitionists will say, that's not the slogan I would have chosen because it doesn't get at all the ways in which we're trying to like transform our society beyond just the police. But yeah, that's what the movements throw up, and so that's what you run with because that's what makes sense. Like this is how politics works. You don't, you don't get to sit around and sort of like focus test messaging when movements are already out in the streets, producing this stuff organically.
Absolutely. Yep.
Right. You get to defund and work toward abolition if you're an abolitionist, right? The funny thing about me, about not about me, but well, other things funny about me, but the funny thing about we don't understand defund. A person shared a tweet and they said, "That's funny. They understood that word when they said defund Planned Parenthood."
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Right, and then the other thing is, it's right. It's not complicated. It's extremely simple. So when they say they don't understand, what does that mean? It's not that they're unable to understand it. It's that they don't want to go there. So you have, I don't know if it's cognitive dissonance or whatever.
No, it's fear, Richie. That's what it is. These people, when they say that it's vague, they don't actually mean it's vague. Liberals who say it's vague, they understand what it means. These are people who have been living with their tails between their legs since Reagan beat Carter, and they have lived in constant fear of what the right is going to say about them. Constant fear. That explains almost all left of center politics in this country going back 4 decades.
I mean, I think that's right. I would add to it also that it's a version of the same thing you see with this like liberal obsession with finding those like good Republicans that are going to stand up to Donald Trump any day now. Defund, it threatens the idea that there's some good core to policing that we can salvage, and that it's bad apples or it's bad policies or it's bad training or something, but that policing is somehow fundamentally necessary and good. And people, abolitionists and defund activists are looking at it and say, no, this entire institution is wrong. This is the wrong way to go about this. This is not what we want, how we want our society to be run. And that is something that's terrifying to a certain.
I think those people, the reform people, should go around and see all the old state hospitals that have been closed, and then go spend some time in prison, and then they'll start and then read some books, and hopefully they'll understand that I say this all the time. It's not about good cops and bad cops. We all know good cops. We all know bad cops, whatever that means. Is there such a thing as a good cop if the police exist for a certain reason as an institution? And that reason is to perpetuate inequality, to perpetuate poverty. And they'll say, no, no, that's not what it is. But there's like literal science that shows this. That's exactly what it is. The poverty industry, poverty prison pipeline, the prison industrial complex. It all has all these names. You can Google all the shit that is made through prison labor. Why? Because you can pay a black guy 50 cents a day or 50 cents an hour or whatever the hell it is to make all your shit if he's in prison. And you got to pay him a living wage if he's not. And where does the funding come to feed that guy in prison? It comes from taxes and it comes from all this other crap. So when you start to actually look at this thing and analyze it and understand it, even if you have no view on it and you simply address it using the scientific method, you cannot come to any other conclusion unless you are completely biased in favor of that system.
Yeah, but there's also a for-profit prison system. You think they want to defund the cops? No. The cops are their bread and butter,
Right.
right? Bill Clinton moved funding billions of dollars from education to for-profit prisons. And so this goes back because all roads eventually lead to capitalism, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when you start talking about material solutions, right, to these problems, such as dollars and cents, less money for the cops, more money for social programs. That leads to a place where even, 90% of the so-called liberals in the halls of power right now do not want to go. And that's why it's a real threat. And that's why they're acting like there's something vague or sort of unstrategic about it.
It's a capitalist solution. Is that what you mean?
Well, I don't know if I would say it's a capitalist solution, but it is a capitalist solution in the sense that it suppresses and sort of hides the ball with what real solutions would be that actually threaten a capitalist system.
Right.
Yeah.
Because,
Okay.
yeah. Because again, it's the idea here is that when we're talking about defunding the police, we're talking about shifting in a direction that handles social problems in a way that is not guys with guns, and it's not arresting
Right.
people and incarcerating people. And so ultimately, yeah, we're talking a big social shift, a big social transformation there. The kind of capitalism we have now and the way it operates is fundamentally built around the kind of policing that we have. I mean, we've only sort of touched on like the context of the pandemic in all of this. That's another way that kind of set the stage for all of this is that you had these lockdowns, these shelter-in-place orders, and people were losing their jobs, people were losing their incomes, people were not getting, people were unable to pay rent. And, what was happening, whether you look at the streets of New York City or the streets of Newburgh, people were not getting the material resources that they really needed to ride out these lockdowns. Instead, what they were getting was cops showing up and busting them for not social distancing enough or whatever, And it's just a perfect example of the way social problems get handled with violence and with police rather than with people giving people the actual resources that they need.
Also, it occurred to everyone during this pandemic that we might just have to change the whole way we think of life in this country, which there was basically a consideration. It crossed everybody's mind that we're going to have to basically suspend capitalism for a time, right? So, in other words, okay, we're going to have to do rent freezes, we're going to have to do some sort of UBI type thing, right? The context in which this happens is when people were already thinking, hey, maybe this is not tenable because we're one virus away from the whole thing going to hell.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look, as inadequate as it all was, when you look at what did happen in terms of, sending out checks to people, juicing up unemployment, there's all this stuff that we've been told for years just, is somehow impossible or impractical. It turns out can happen overnight when there's the will to do it. And I do think that has played a role in sort of changing people's expectations of what's possible.
Yeah, like we can't find $60 billion a year for tuition-free public college. Are you kidding me?
I know.
They found $5 trillion in the snap of a finger. I mean, it's absolutely on its face absurd.
I mean, well, also like that 2 trillion didn't grow on trees, right? Where did it come from? And essentially it came from the future, right? I mean, money's weird, right? How money works in terms of like, you know, credit and all that. It's a lot to unpack to understand how capitalism came to be and then how complicated it all got. Because you know, if we're gonna be on the line with the democratic socialist here, let's talk about a little bit, if we can, the banking um, industry and the financial sector as it connects to the word capitalism, what capitalism really means, and the idea that the poverty prison pipeline industry and all this money that they can find for one thing and not have for another and all this stuff. And then to look at the real sort of who's really pulling the strings here.
I mean, you can compare the way, looking back again to the Obama period, you can compare the way they dealt with the Black Lives Matter uprisings against police violence with the way they handled the financial crisis after 2008, which is that they didn't want to challenge the fundamental power structures, whether that's the power of big banks or whether the power of police and prisons. And so they just tried to muddle through and make some nice looking reforms, but the underlying problem remains, which is the existence of policing and prisons and the tremendous concentration of wealth and power in this country. And so that's that. And then if nothing fundamentally changes unless you are willing to contest that.
Yeah, I mean they cracked down harder on homeowners, uh, disproportionately black homeowners who may have lied on their mortgages to get the houses, right? Harder than they did on anybody who actually caused that to happen. And that was, Obama's Justice Department could have done that all at the executive branch level, even if he did not have supermajorities in both houses. He could have ordered, who was his first attorney general? Was Holder, right? He could have ordered him to go do it, go turn over every stone and find out what happened to make sure that these people, suffer the consequences for it. Instead, they went after the little people.
And at a time when they had the banks where they, in a position where they could have nationalized them, they instead bailed them out. And that comes down to the fundamental class interest in resolving the crisis in a way that did not fundamentally challenge the power of big capital.
Right. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because as we're getting ready to wrap, one of the challenges that we saw emerge with the two Sanders campaigns, 2016 and this one, is an inability to really fuse liberation struggle with class struggle in a way that created a coalition that can get to that 51% mark. And this has the potential to create that. And so there is a Marxist sort of analysis that says basically, all forms of injustice are born of a certain class structure. And you can have that analysis while still not being a class reductionist, right? In other words, you can balance those two things in your head. Like, I think most injustice is people in power kicking the shit out of people who don't have power. That's a sort of top-down way of thinking about it. But that does not suggest that you have to look. I'm trying to think of a way to make this point. It's a tough point to sort of make. I hope you kind of know where I'm going with this, Peter, and can bail me out as someone who's.
Because I think yes, I am a Marxist, and I do see the fundamental problem with our society as being the relationship between capital and labor that structures it. And I think that where people get mixed up is in thinking kind of broadly and deeply enough about class struggle and what class struggle is and how it manifests. And so I think what's been running through the discussion we've been having when whether we're talking about municipal budgets or whether we're talking about the role the police play in supporting private property rights and specifically real estate capital, is that the struggle against the police is every bit as much of a class struggle as what happens, organizing against the boss in your workplace. That class struggle happens at these different levels of society, and that you can have a completely Marxist and class-centered analysis that puts the struggle to defund the police right up there, with the struggle to nationalize the banks.
Yeah, because to go there, it's not only black people that are being killed unjustly by the police. And some people, in order to discredit the Black Lives Movement, the movement for Black lives, whatever we want to term it, by saying, well, the police kill more white people than Black people, so Black people should shut up. It's kind of and I'm like, no, it's the reverse, because what's happening to Black people is real and it's true. There may be certain ways to look at statistics that make you think this or that, but the fact is, all that's happening to them, and worse, they're not just being killed, they're being mistreated in every way possible. In addition to that, it also happens that white people are being killed in certain numbers, relative to our population, whatever. So it's a police problem, period.
And the point is, and the point of saying Black Lives Matter, this has been said innumerable times by many people. The point is not that only Black Lives matter. On the contrary, right. The point is that what happens to Black people, and and what happens as a result of the racist quality of capitalism, that kind of has ramifications for the entire society. And that when Black lives don't matter, all of our lives are degraded in some way as people who are not the rich, who are not the capitalist class. And so, white people get got killed by the police in this country at a lower rate than Black people, but at a much higher rate than people in, say, European countries, right? So, our incarceration rates are much higher for Black people, but white people in this country are incarcerated at vastly higher rates than people in other countries, right? And so it's identifying this, the Black Lives Matter struggle as a key point, a key aspect of the larger class struggle in society, and saying that if we don't address this kind of core of oppression and exploitation, then we're not going to be able to, improve conditions for anybody, really.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting. This is where I found common ground with Marxists and other people as socialists.
What do you mean common ground? You're not a Marxist? Joking. Go ahead.
I am a certain breed of Christian. I was brought up to maybe I'm an inner Marxist that I never knew about. I haven't read a lot of the the stuff that well, some people claim they're Marxists and haven't read a lot of that stuff, but guys like Peter and they have. But I grew up listening to I don't know, I guess you could call it the good Christian leaders who spoke about Jesus in a way that was kind of, I guess, Marxist, right? It talks about how class existed, and as a good Christian, you should work to remove the things that are rigged, in class-structured hierarchy, because rich people aren't any better than poor people, and poor people aren't worse than rich people. And if you look at a lot of the stuff attributed, to the savior of humankind, whatever his true color is, and it sure as hell isn't white. A lot of that guy was talking about was class struggle. It's all over the place. So when I started to hear Marxists and people talk about class struggle from a sociological or philosophical point of view, I'm like, they're saying the same shit my priest said.
I mean, look, I'm not a religious person. I wasn't, brought up that way, but my take on this would be that, Marxism specifically is a theory of capitalism. And so, there was no capitalism really when Jesus was around. And so he couldn't have been a Marxist, but he was a communist, which is a much longer tradition than just Marxism. And because, he was absolutely a communist.
Yeah, Marxism, right, exactly. Marxism is more a sort of analysis of capitalism than a prescription for a communist sort of utopia. But anyway, I regret to inform you guys that we don't have time to do another hour on Marxism. So, but the good news is I would love to have both you guys on again. It's been way too long for Richie and way too long for you, Peter, as well. So thanks, guys, for making the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a great discussion.
Peter, do you have any writings that are out recently that you want to plug? I know we talked about your book last time, For Futures. That's available. Anything else?
Not anything super recent. I did a little bit of, had some stuff come out earlier on in the earlier stages of the pandemic, but I've been sort of caught up in the political work here, but hopefully I will produce, sometime soon some more reflective stuff on this political moment and on the work against the police. So keep you can follow me on Twitter and check out what I'm up to when it drops.
Awesome. Everybody do that. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. You can like us on Facebook, follow us on SoundCloud, subscribe to this podcast on any major podcast player. Also, subscribe to our new podcast project, the Dissident Film Club. That is a new podcast that we started, a sort of spin off of this one that focuses on political and revolutionary cinema, past and present. We're going to have a new episode of that coming up soon, so please find that. That is on all major podcast players right now. Please also check us out at patreon.com/do dissidents, where you can support this show for as little as a dime a day and get access to exclusive content. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your continued support. We'll see you next time.